Good morning, everybody, and a very, very warm welcome to you to the Family Law Roundup for March of 2026. Thank you so much to all of you who have made the time to be here on a Tuesday morning, and please do accept my sincere apologies that we were unable to present this session last week. My internet signal was just much worse than I had anticipated. I am in a spot with fair signal, so hopefully we will be able to get through the roundup without um, any issues today. Shantae is standing by. If I do drop off the call, she will jump in and take all of you folks through the remainder of the cases. Thank you for that, Shantae. Guys, I've got 19 very interesting cases for you this morning, all from March of 2026. We're going to start with divorce cases, then we are going to go through some children's matters, various Rule 43s, a case on life partnerships, one on burial rights, and then even a domestic violence matter, which one does not see very often. So, yeah, let's get into it. For those of you who do need to run off to court or into consults, please rest assured we are recording this session because of the time change, and we will make it available on our YouTube channel for you to catch up. So let's go into the formalities. Very few today. In terms of formalities, among the few formalities that we have, just in terms of what Think Legal is, it's a platform for the open exchange of trusted legal knowledge. We aim to connect professionals through dialogue, practical insights, and meaningful engagement across our platforms, trainings, and events. If you want to get involved with any of these, please go to thinklegal.co. You can register for our events. You can join our WhatsApp groups. At present, we have the Family Law WhatsApp group, the Commercial Litigation and Labor Law WhatsApp group, and the Events Notifications WhatsApp group. Then also allied with us is the Mediator Support Circle, which is moderated by our friend and colleague Ornay Low for mediators to debrief, share war stories, and so forth. You can purchase resources and you can view past webinars by going to thinklegal.co.za. If you are inclined to do so, please do purchase the optional course pack. It's 350 Rand, and it gives you all of these summaries, which I'm going to be covering today. I'll give you a quick sneak peek on my iPad. Summaries look alike. So we give you the citation, the court, an overview of the case, aspects covered, an outcome, together with a brief rundown of what was held and some notable quotes to use within your practice. For this round, as a bit of a, shall we say, a courtesy to our followers, we have made available the bundle free of charge, which I've popped on the WhatsApp group. I will put it on the WhatsApp group a bit later today. So the bundle we are giving away for free this month. However, the summaries, which is what really takes a lot of our time to prepare, is something that you will be able to purchase from the website, thinklegal.co.za. Go to our online shop there and you can purchase it. Alternatively, you can pop me an email. Email mervin@vermeulenlaw.co.za or email Jadene, Jadene, @vermeulenlaw.co.za, and we will gladly assist you to get hold of the course pack. As always, our sincerest thanks to Lawbox, MV Incorporated, and Vermeulen Attorneys for their support for what we do at Think Legal. Right, without further ado, let's get into it. I told you guys there would be very few formalities this morning. So, first off, we're going to start with a very interesting divorce case all the way from the KwaZulu-Natal High Court in Durban. The presiding judge is Henriques J. And this is a divorce matter where, interestingly, the court was tasked to determine whether the one parent's parental responsibilities and rights should be terminated in terms of Section 28 of the Children's Act. There were also issues involved in terms of forfeiture of patrimonial benefits. This was a marriage in community of property. So what was in dispute was PRR, and specifically this claim that I believe it was the defendant should forfeit the patrimonial benefits of the marriage, and then in terms of the PRR claim that their parental responsibilities and rights be terminated in terms of Section 28 of the Children's Act. So in the trial, during the course of the trial, there was extensive evidence regarding aspects such as domestic violence, medical condition and care of the minor child, and essentially the defendant's failure to contribute financially and otherwise. There were multiple Rule 43 and Rule 43.6 matters leading up to the trial, which were all taken into account. The court essentially then had to make the determination on whether forfeiture should be granted and whether there should be a termination. And please distinguish this from a suspension. This is a full-on termination of parental responsibilities and rights. Starting off with the forfeiture, forfeiture was granted in favor of the plaintiff in respect of pension interests and immovable property. The defendant's parental responsibilities and rights were terminated. This was a full termination of PRR and not just a suspension, which is what I've seen over the years is more the favored order because it leaves the door open for future changes in circumstances. But this was a full termination. Our notable quotes in this matter come from paragraph 185 and 188 of the judgment. I'll start with 185. The court states, as upper guardian of the minor child, I do not believe it is in their interests to be forced to maintain contact with someone who has made no emotional or financial effort. It's interesting to see how the court utilizes that specific issue as a factor in the best interests of a child determination in terms of Section 7. So someone who has made no emotional or financial effort, the defendant referred to. Paragraph 188, the court deals with forfeiture. In addition, the plaintiff is the sole contributor to a pension fund and was also solely responsible for the maintenance and upkeep of the immovable property at Chatsworth. Save for a vague allegation of contributing to the paving in 2006, the defendant has made no contribution to such immovable property. I do not believe his assertions that he made any contributions at all to the upkeep, maintenance, or the acquiring of such a property in any way. It was never the intention for him to benefit in any way. It was only the plaintiff who signed the AOD, and her evidence that her mother did not want him to benefit was unchallenged. It was only registered jointly in their names as the defendant refused to register an antenuptial contract. This is a very interesting aspect, and there are two things that I want to cherry pick from this quote, which I think are very relevant to all of you. First off, the court relies on the contributions or lack thereof in determining whether forfeiture should be granted in this instance. The court is increasingly doing this, obviously contribution not being a factor in Section 9.1, but because the Section 9.1 factors are essentially non-patrimonial or non-financial, if we look at the duration of the marriage, misconduct, and circumstances which gave rise to the breakdown, there is nothing really financial to latch onto in that test. So the court's increasingly utilizing the idea of contribution. Secondly, is this phenomenon of the immovable property was only registered jointly in their names as the defendant refused to register an antenuptial contract. This means that the parties were married in community of property, and the property then had to be registered to both of them as co-owners. It could not be registered only to one of them. This is very interesting. This is something that we see from time to time in marriages in community of property, where a party would very vehemently and very unequivocally say in consultation, I bought the property. I paid for it, I chose it, I negotiated it. It was only registered in my spouse's name as well as mine because of the marriage in community of property. Very interestingly, the court makes reference to this in paragraph 188 of the judgment in NJ versus OJ and brings it into the forfeiture analysis. So if you're dealing with any of those matters or a matter such as that, please do go and give this very interesting judgment by Henri J. in the Durban High Court a read. Next up, we're going all the way back up to the South Gauteng High Court, where a matter was conducted as a trial within a trial before Mogotsi AJ. For those of you who are interested in following along, it is on page 2 of your summaries, and it is on page 50 of your bundle, giving you an idea of how long our first judgment was. Now, what was interesting on this matter was the manner in which the anti-nuptial contract was considered by the court, and specifically how the validity thereof was considered by the court. And this took place in a trial within a trial, which is usually utilized to determine admissibility of evidence. Now, the reason why it happened like this was because there was a previous Rule 33(4) application to determine the validity of the ANC first and separately, which was unsuccessful. So the matter was then set down for trial, and the trial court had to determine the issue on the anti-nuptial contract, which it then did on a trial within a trial. Now, the defendant was the party challenging the validity of the anti-nuptial contract, and the court interestingly refers to the defendant's approach as the litigation progressed as the shifting and evolving, open and close quote, attack on the ANC. And what is evident from this judgment is that the defendant at different times raised different points to attack the validity of the ANC. What the court had to determine, interpret, was whether the excluded assets were sufficiently identified in terms of the Matrimonial Property Act, and to determine whether the clauses relating to exclusion of future assets rendered the anti-nuptial contract void. The court looks at various aspects, and I'm not going to spend too much time on the aspects covered in this family law roundup. You are welcome to go and have a look at the judgment to see exactly what the court's reasoning was. But what is important is that in this instance, the court found the ANC to be valid. It was declared to be valid, and the parties were, in essence, then married out of community of property, subject to the accrual system, and the matter was then to proceed to trial on that basis. The court, in making its decision, tells us in paragraph 18 the following. In the context of anti-nuptial contracts specifically, a court must have regard to the statutory framework within which such contracts operate. As held in RP versus PP, a clause must be construed within the context of the anti-nuptial contract as a whole, the prevailing law governing the proprietary consequences of the marriage, the party's intention, and the purpose for which the provision was included. Very nice kind of summarization of the manner in which to interpret an antenuptial contract. Paragraph 28, the court then says something very interesting, I feel. The court says to attack the ANC on the basis of linguistic imprecision, when the party's common intention is not in dispute, is to elevate form over substance. The crux of the matter, friends and colleagues, can you determine, having regard to the antenuptial contract, what the common intention of the parties was? If that common intention is clear, the ANC stands. This was WLF versus RSF. This is the trial within a trial before Mokgotsi AJ in the South Gauteng High Court. Next up, we go north of the Yexke River to the Pretoria High Court. Oh, my apologies. This is also South Gauteng High Court. Sorry, we stay in the promised land. TMN versus YN. This is South Gauteng High Court, Johannesburg. The presiding judge, Vosloo de Wit, AJ. Summary, page 3, and bundle, page 60. This is a matter dealing with the Actio Communi Dividundo, which, as we all know, is the legal remedy of termination of joint co-ownership of an asset. And what was specifically looked at, very interestingly, in this judgment was the pactum de non dividundo and the aspects of bound versus free co-ownership. The matter reached the court on application, and it was for the termination of joint ownership of a former matrimonial home following a decree of divorce. The divorce was granted on strength of a settlement agreement, which was made in order of court simultaneously with the divorce. The applicant sought the Actio Communi Dividundo relief after a variation of care and contact arrangements placed the minor children in his primary care, so they were no longer residing with the respondent who was residing in the property in question. The respondent opposed the application and argued that the settlement agreement which they signed in the divorce proceedings created bound co-ownership, or a pactum de non dividundo. The court was tasked with determining whether the co-ownership was in fact free co-ownership or bound co-ownership, whether the agreement restricted the division of the property in terms of the Actio Communi Dividundo, and whether it was equitable to order the sale of the property and division of the proceeds. The court relies heavily on the SCA decision of Robson versus Tron all the way back to 1978, which is still one of our seminal cases on Actio Communi Dividundo. And the court gives a very interesting rundown of the ideas of free co-ownership, bound co-ownership, and this concept of pactum de non dividundo. In this instance, the applicant was successful. The Actio Communi Dividundo relief was granted, the property was ordered to be sold, and the proceeds equally divided. The respondent was mulcted with the costs of the application. Paragraphs 32 to 34, I think, set out the reasoning of the court quite nicely. And the court states as follows. Co-ownership is not a permanent state of affairs. The SCA in Robson versus Tron affirmed the principle that no co-owner is normally obliged to remain such against their will. This foundational rule underpins the Actio Communi Dividundo. It provides a co-owner with a legal mechanism to compel division of the jointly owned property when agreement cannot be reached. The continued joint ownership of the property has become a source of ongoing conflict between the parties. Paragraph 33. Paragraph 34, the court finds it would be inequitable to compel the applicant to remain indefinitely bound to co-ownership of the property in circumstances where the underlying basis for such arrangement has ceased to exist. I think the focus of the court on the underlying basis for the arrangement is very important here. If the underlying reason for the parties to be co-owners has fallen away, then it is inequitable, according to the court in TMN versus YN, to compel a co-owner to remain indefinitely bound to co-ownership of the property in such circumstances. That was TMN versus YN. This is from the South Gauteng High Court, Vosloo-de-Wet AJ, and this was 6th of March 2026. Next up, we go all the way to the Northwest High Court in Mafeking, before Maudi AJ, the matter of HMM versus EBM and others. This is on summary page 4 and bundle page 69. The matter is a rescission or a variation of a decree of divorce based on a mistake common to the parties. Very interestingly, the parties got divorced on the strength of a mistaken belief regarding their matrimonial property regime. The parties believed that they were married out of community of property with the accrual based on an antenuptial contract which was only executed after the marriage, which we know is not valid. In the premises, the parties are married in community of property. The court had to determine whether the mistaken belief of being married out with accrual constituted a common mistake or a mistake common to the parties, whether the antenuptial contract was valid. Obviously, it was not. It was executed after the marriage. There's no ante in this antenuptial contract. And whether the divorce should be varied to reflect the correct matrimonial property system. The divorce decree was varied. The application was successful. The marriage was held to be in community of property, and an order was granted that the joint estate be divided equally. The first respondent was mulcted with the costs. Paragraph 18, very interesting in terms of the reasoning of Maudi AJ. He says the following, or they say the following: I disagree with the findings in Schmitz and Lawser as put forward by the first respondent. The main contention on the antenuptial contract is that the applicant says there was no contract between the parties at the time of the marriage. Correct. While the first respondent says there was a contract, albeit not registered. The first respondent relies on a purported certificate issued by attorneys in confirming this unregistered contract. However, the first respondent has not attached any confirmatory affidavit by the attorneys to that effect. The approach by the first respondent is untenable and cannot be allowed. I've emphasized this next section in the quote. You'll see if you purchase the course pack, even if the first respondent had established some sort of a contract between the parties, if it was not registered at the time of the marriage, it cannot be said to be an antenuptial contract. The provisions of section 21 of the MPA would have to apply. In other words, if there's no ANC at the time of the marriage, then the marriage is in community of property. This was HMM versus EBM, that is Maudi AJ from the Northwest High Court in Mahikeng. Next up, we stay on divorce matters and we go to the court of Ndlokovane AJ, the 6th of March 2026 in the North Gauteng High Court in Pretoria. The matter is JEP and others versus LBP and others. You can find it in your summaries on page 5 and in your bundle on page 81. The matter relates to financial disclosure and subpoenas which were issued. It was an urgent application in terms of Rule 612 for subpoenas to be set aside in pending divorce procedures or proceedings. The subpoenas were for disclosure of bank statements. Not only bank statements of the parties, but also of, I believe it was a trust which was involved. The applicants sought to prevent disclosure of allegedly confidential financial information relating to the said bank accounts. The court had to determine urgency, as always, and whether substantial redress could be obtained in due course, particularly where some of the subpoenaed documents had already been accessed. In other words, in some instances, the horse had already bolted. Now, as we know, the Gauteng High Courts in particular, with the introduction of the financial disclosure form, have brought financial disclosure in divorce matters to the forefront of consideration in these types of matters. And what we are seeing much more often than not is that the court is in favor of disclosure over non-disclosure. And unsurprisingly, in this instance, the application was struck from the roll for lack of urgency. The applicants were ordered to pay the costs. The court at paragraph 21 of the judgment very succinctly comments that urgency must not be self-created, and the court then goes on at paragraph 24 to say once the documents had already been accessed, the event sought to be prevented had effectively occurred. In other words, the matter is not urgent, the horse has bolted, and you can get redress in due course. JEP and others versus LBP and others. It's North Gauteng High Court in Pretoria. Right, next up, we are still in divorce matters. We are on IJM versus GJM. This is 24 March of 2026. Mogotsi AJ in the South Gauteng High Court in Johannesburg. You can find the summary on page 5 of your summaries bundle, and the judgment you can find on page 88 of the bundle of judgments. This is a divorce matter where care and contact arrangements for minor children were at the forefront. The defendant sought equal shared residence on a week-on, week-off basis and proposed that each parent maintain the children while in their care. The plaintiff opposed the immediate implementation of shared residence for the youngest child due to her age and the need for stability. The court had to determine what arrangements would be in the best interests of the children under the circumstances, having regard to a family advocate's report. The family advocate's recommendations in this instance were upheld. Shared residence for the older child was confirmed and made an order, and gradual contact for the younger child, so phased in approach in terms of the younger child. Two notable quotes in IJM versus GJM, which I want to alert you to. The first is paragraph 9 of the judgment. The court states, The guiding principle is the best interest of the child standard, enshrined in Section 28(2) of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, and given detailed content in Section 7 of the Children's Act. Section 6(2)(a) of the Act further provides that proceedings concerning a child must prioritize a child-centered approach which respects the child's right to participate appropriately. As Howie J.A. reminded in F versus F, this type of litigation is not of the ordinary civil kind. It is fundamentally a judicial investigation into the child's welfare rather than an adversarial contest between the parties. The court goes on in paragraph 19 to say that the Constitutional Court affirmed in Baynash and another versus Ernst & Young and others that access to courts does not entitle a litigant to abuse the judicial process. The defendant failed to establish dispute during cross-examination. Despite the court's intervention, he proceeded on new issues that were not raised with the plaintiff, thereby denying her an opportunity to respond thereto. His actions, in my view, constitute an abuse of the court's process. Interesting quote there on abuse of processes, which we included because this was a matter fundamentally involving children, and very often we do unfortunately see the baby going out with the bathwater in matters revolving around children, where statements are made such as children's matters are inherently urgent and so forth. This was IJM versus GJM before Mokgotsi AJ in the South Gauteng High Court in Johannesburg. I have one more matter for you before we do our quick 2 or 3 minute break for you to go and refill your cups of coffee. And that is the children's matter of AH versus Mose and another. This was in the South Gauteng High Court in Johannesburg. It was before Makume J, and you can find it in your bundle on page 94 and in your summaries on page 7. It was launched as a review against proceedings that took place in the Children's Court. The regional or the Children's Court Commissioner or the magistrate sitting in the Children's Court made a parenting plan an order of court, and the applicant in the review believed that that was irregular for several reasons which are apparent in the judgment. The applicant essentially contended that because the parenting plan was made an order of court in her absence before completion of a social worker's report and without proper consideration of Section 21 of the Children's Act dealing with unmarried fathers, the order was inappropriately granted, or incorrectly granted, or irregularly, I think is the best word there, isn't it? The court, per Makume J, had to determine whether a reviewable irregularity existed. The question was raised whether the magistrate erred in procedure, whether the applicant had sufficient notice of the hearing, and whether the second respondent had acquired parental responsibilities and rights. Now remember, this was a Section 21 father, as is evident from the judgment. The review was dismissed. The order making the parenting plan an order of court in the Children's Court was upheld, and the applicant was ordered to pay the costs. Paragraphs 38 and 29 are our notable quotes from this judgment, which I'll read to you. Let's start from the back going forwards. Let's do paragraph 38 first. The parenting plan was agreed upon by both parties and was made an order of court. This was after the presiding officer satisfied himself that the family advocate had adequately dealt with all the directives contained in his letter through the family advocate. In other words, the High Court found that there was sufficient consideration of the family advocate's inputs and that the parties had freely and voluntarily entered into the parenting plan. Paragraph 29, in dealing with the absence of the applicant at the proceedings, the court says, in my view, this ground of review is misguided and falls to be dismissed. The applicant and his attorney knew about the new date and decided to stay away. There is no indication that the attorney attempted to find out from the clerk of the court what date had been decided upon. Cannot simply stay away is the lesson that we learn here. This is AH versus Mose and another per Makume J in the South Gauteng High Court. For those of you wanting to take a quick bio break, recharge your cup of coffee, please do so now, as I tell everybody in the meeting about thinklegal.co.za, which is our only plug for this edition of the Family Law Roundup. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Think Legal Initiative, and I see quite a few new names in our attendance list today, if you want to learn more and if you want to get involved with some of the things that we do within Think Legal, please go to thinklegal.co.za. You can register for some of our events. You can join our WhatsApp groups, purchase resources, and view our past webinars. Specifically, I would like to invite all of you who are not yet on our WhatsApp groups to go to thinklegal.co.za, go to WhatsApp groups on the website, and there you can fill in our registration forms to join our WhatsApp groups. We have 3 WhatsApp groups which we maintain directly, and a further one with which we are aligned, and we assist them with their administration. Our 3 groups are the Family Law WhatsApp group, which on the last tally had just over, I think it's just over 800 family professionals all across South Africa, ranging the spectrum from lawyers to mental health professionals to ADR professionals and associated professionals. We do moderate the WhatsApp groups quite carefully, and they are only open between 7 and 7. Further, we have our commercial litigation and labor law WhatsApp group, which you are more than welcome to join as well. I think on that one we have about 500 or so members. And then finally, our events notification WhatsApp group, where you can see what is going on in terms of industry events. Then finally, we assist the Mediator Support Circle group, which you can also join via our website, which is a place for mediators to support one another and to debrief, which is moderated by our friend and colleague, Ornay Lowe. Right. Plugs aside, let's go on to the next case. We have a whole wad of Rule 43 judgments to share with you today. We've got 2, 4, 6, 7 Rule 43 matters, which we are going to discuss this morning. And I want to start off with JVDB versus OVDB. It is in the Eastern Circuit Local Division in Thembalethu, which is just outside of George, and the judge there, Tulare J of the Western Cape Division. They generally cart the judges from the Western Cape High Court in Cape Town to the Eastern Circuit Local Division in Thembalethu. So JVDB versus OVDB per Tulare J. You can find the summary of the judgment on page 8, and you can find the judgment on page 106 of the bundle. I find this judgment very interesting because Tulare J, in usual fashion, does not mince words when making findings regarding the respondent. And let's run through it. It's an opposed urgent Rule 43.6 application in a divorce. The applicant had sought interim maintenance of 65,000 Rand for herself and minor child, medical aid, use of a motor vehicle, specified care and contact, and a contribution of 200,000 Rand towards legal costs. A prior Rule 43 had regulated aspects of maintenance and postponed others pending investigation by a social worker and family advocate. The court had to determine whether there was a material change in circumstances warranting variation, assess the respondent's financial position, and to determine appropriate interim relief. The applicant did not walk away empty-handed. She walked away with 25,000 Rand per month maintenance, 3,000 Rand child maintenance, medical aid, vehicle use, schooling cost, and the 200,000 Rand contribution to legal costs. The court in paragraph 11 is very forthright in chiding the respondent. I find it extremely selfish and lacking in self-respect to hear a rich husband who can afford to maintain his wife claiming that the wife must first look to her own parents to support her before she can approach him for maintenance. It is on the same footing and should be as shameful as a man who can afford to maintain his child saying a mother must first look to government's childcare grant before claiming maintenance from him. It's a serious patriarchal misdirection and frankly behavior that shows lack of good sense and judgment, which is anchored on plain greed and is intended purely to hurt another. It is an action intended to harm in return for a bruised ego for which the perpetrator has a desire to repay a perceived injury or wrong. It's never about maintenance but revenge. It is a thinking that stands to be rejected. For these reasons, I make the order. Very interesting and very strong words from Tulare J. I also liked paragraph 8 of the judgment, where the court says the following. Parents should arrange for situations where children function in an emotional comfort zone. I like that. The children must function in an emotional comfort zone. For especially younger children, where possible, everything should be as predictable as possible. The developments and environment should be familiar to enable the child to explore an emotionally secure and physically safe world. Very interesting quote from Tulare J. Paragraph 8 goes on, but I'm not going to go through the whole of the paragraph. You are welcome to go and have a look yourself at that. Next up, we go to the Supreme Court of Appeal. Now, this is a very, very interesting appeal matter on Rule 43, which is an appeal from, I believe it was the Western Cape High Court. Yes, it was the Western Cape High Court. BE versus NT and others. Then we have the Quorum of Molemela P, Zondi DP, Mukumi JA, and Steyn and Govinji AJJA, hearing the matter within the SCA. The matter deals with the appealability of a Rule 43 matter and whether a particular portion of the order was capable of being taken on appeal. What had happened in the court a quo is that a Rule 43 was granted recognizing a duty of support on a step parent. The appellant contended that this development of the common law in finding that a step parent has a maintenance responsibility rendered the order final in effect. The court was then called upon to decide whether the order constituted a decision, open quote, close quote, under Section 16(1)(a) of the Superior Courts Act, and whether the intervention of the SCA was justified by the interests of justice. So just to recap, the argument was that the Rule 43 order is one thing, but the finding that a step parent has a maintenance responsibility is final in effect, and for that reason, the SCA should intervene on appeal. The SCA disagreed. The appeal was struck from the roll on the basis that the court lacked jurisdiction in that a Rule 43 order is not appealable. Paragraph 21 is very interesting from this judgment, and it gives us a nice peek into the court's reasoning. This submission overstates the reach of the High Court's reasoning. The order granted by the High Court was provisional and revisable rather than final in effect. In terms of Rule 43.6, the order remains susceptible to reconsideration by the High Court upon a material change in circumstances. It is also inherently capable of correction or reversal by the trial court when the divorce action is determined after the evidence has been fully ventilated. The relief granted does not finally determine any right, nor does it dispose of any substantive portion of the relief claimed in the main action, which includes the dissolution of the marriage, the final determination of maintenance obligations, and the calculation of the accrual. Any legal conclusions reached were made in the context of Rule 43 proceedings pendente lite and for the limited purpose of regulating the extent of interim relief considered appropriate on the facts before the High Court. Those findings do not bind the trial court, which remains free to determine the stepchildren's entitlement to maintenance afresh in the divorce proceedings, based on the evidence to be presented. This lack of finality, viewed together with the comity owed to the trial court, is a further indication that the appellate intervention would not be in the interests of justice. The SCA finding that the interim maintenance granted in favor of stepchildren was not, in fact, appealable, and that the final decision rests with the trial court in due course. Next up, we go to the South Gauteng High Court, and we have an appeal again on a Rule 43 in the matter of ES versus HZA before Fisher J and Senyatsi and Dlamini JJ concurring with the judgment penned by Fisher J. You can find it on page 10 of your summaries and page 130 of your bundles. This is an appeal dealing with a Muslim marriage and a talaq, which was granted, and a Rule 43, or a talaq which was issued, and a Rule 43 which was heard after the issue of the talaq. The High Court, the Court a quo, ruled that it lacked jurisdiction. Apologies, it's that time of the day when my tongue gets tongue-tied. It lacked jurisdiction to adjudicate the Rule 43 on the basis that the parties were no longer spouses after a talaq was issued under Sharia law. The court had to determine whether such a jurisdictional ruling was appealable and whether a party to a Muslim marriage terminated by talaq could still invoke Rule 43 pending the civil divorce proceedings. Unsurprisingly, the appeal was upheld. The jurisdictional ruling was set aside, and the Rule 43 application may be re-enrolled. The respondent was ordered to pay the costs. Paragraph 84, the court says very concisely, to put a finer point on it, with reference to the judgment under appeal, the term spouse in Rule 43.1 should be read expressly to include Muslim women, notwithstanding the termination of her marriage under Sharia law. That is ES versus HZA. A spouse in a Muslim marriage cannot escape Rule 43 responsibilities by quickly issuing a talaq before the Rule 43 can be instituted. That is ES versus HZA. Next up, we go to SB versus JB, and this is in the South Gauteng High Court, Johannesburg. Once again, the judge is Langer AJ, summary page 11, bundle page 148. It is a Rule 43 for interim maintenance, and a contribution towards legal costs. The matter was opposed, and the applicant essentially sought 55,000 Rand per month and a contribution of 250K to legal costs. The respondent initially tendered payment of various expenses, 20,000 Rand cash maintenance and 30,000 Rand towards legal costs, but withdrew that tender at the hearing. The court considered the applicant's financial dependence on the respondent's financial control over expenses, and then had to determine the reasonableness of the applicant's revised claim. The applicant was awarded 28,500 Rand monthly maintenance plus ancillaries and 100,000 Rand contribution to costs. Paragraph 21 is an interesting paragraph in this judgment, and it deals with the court-annexed mediation quite obliquely, but it's interesting to see it brought into Rule 43. So let me read it to you. Counsel for the respondent argued that the applicant cannot bring an application for 250,000 Rand with a flawed pro forma invoice and then do a sudden volte-face at court and admit that a more reasonable amount is 100,000. He contended that the applicant had not made out a case for even the 100,000 Rand cost contribution now being sought. It is the respondent's view that the only issue for determination at trial is the question of whether the applicant is entitled to spousal maintenance for life, as she prays for in her summons, or only rehabilitative maintenance as tendered by the respondent in his counterclaim. Furthermore, the parties have not even attended court-annexed mediation as is now required in this division, which could further curtail the expenses actually incurred. In reply, counsel for the applicant submitted that the mediation would also attract costs, which the applicant could not afford. If one has regard to the pro forma invoice attached to the applicant's sworn statement and removes the items which both counsels identified as problematic, the amount being sought of 100,000 Rand is not excessive, and the order granted on those terms. I'm surprised that we don't see more references in Rule 43 matters, in the judgments at least that come out, to the Gauteng Mediation Directive, and specifically how that dovetails with applications for contributions to costs. That is going to be very interesting to see it play out over the next couple of years. Next up, we stay in Gauteng, the South Gauteng High Court in Johannesburg, before Smit AJ, summary page 12, bundle page 158. The matter is CMN versus NN. And this deals with a Rule 43 for maintenance pendente litigae in respect of a child born outside the marriage. The husband sought interim maintenance of 4,500 Rand per month for a minor child born outside the marriage, shared control of rental income from property, and a costs order. Both parties were unemployed and reliant on the rental income from cottages on the property. The court had to determine whether the wife owed a duty of support to the child and whether Rule 43 permitted relief in that instance. The court found that in the negative. The application was dismissed, costs to be costs in the divorce. Paragraph 12 reads as follows. On the evidence before me, the wife has never undertaken duties of support to the minor child. In these circumstances, she has no inherent duty to support the child born to her husband outside the marriage. Our law no longer considers it against public policy to afford a spouse maintenance after divorce, even though that spouse has been cohabiting with another person as a romantic couple before divorce. But our law also does not recognize a minor child's claim for support against a person married to their biological parent unless such a person has explicitly undertaken duties of support. This obviously, folks, is to be distinguished from the matter earlier where it was a step parent, specifically where duties of support seem to have been undertaken. So please do just distinguish those two. Next up, we go to HL versus BPAL, also in the South Gauteng High Court, also Smith AJ. You can find this on paragraph or page 12 of your summaries and page 164 of your bundles. This is the Rule 43 regarding child maintenance and affordability, essentially, and the ACUT approach. Now, many of you will know about the matter of ACUT versus ACUT and the ratio, and it's to an extent where we've fallen into this practice of 2 shares, 1 share in maintenance calculations. When you read this judgment of HL versus BPAL, please do read it with ACUT next to it. You can find it on Jutau or on Safley. Essentially, this was an opposed Rule 43. There were 3 minor children. The wife sought orders relating care and contact, decision-making regarding schooling and extramurals, appointments of a PC, child maintenance of 20,000 Rand per child per month, spousal maintenance, arrear maintenance of just under 300,000 Rand, arrear school fees of 33,000 Rand, and a contribution of 350,000 Rand to legal costs. The court ordered a shared residence regime, 35,000 Rand monthly child maintenance, arrear school fees, 5,000 Rand monthly contribution to legal costs, no spousal maintenance, costs to be costs in the cause. The court refers to the ACUT principle in paragraph 32 of the judgment. It is necessary to restate a basic principle regarding maintenance and other contributions, pendente lite. The spouse from whom maintenance or other contribution is sought must be able to pay what they are ordered to pay. This is the case even where one party has deliberately impoverished themselves to escape a duty of support. Claims for support pendente lite should not be used to preempt remedies that could only be made upon the dissolution of the marriage. Then if you go and look at paragraph 38, which I'm not going to read out, you can have a look at the ACUT principle and what the court in HL versus BPAL does with that principle. Next up, we go to the Free State High Court in Bloemfontein, folks, and this is we're almost at the end of the roundup. We've got another 6 matters to go through, this matter inclusive. I am trying to keep it short, as I know a lot of us need to run off and go and hit our days. So this is before Naidu J, summary page 13, bundle page 181, the matter of VH versus VH. This is a contempt of court against a Rule 43 or on the backdrop of a Rule 43 order, coupled with a Rule 43.6 application, which we heard concurrently. So it was a contempt of court arising from non-compliance with the Rule 43 order, directing the respondent to pay spousal maintenance contribution to cost and to facilitate removal of household items. Respondent opposed, brought a counter application in terms of 43.6 to vary the order by deleting the maintenance and cost obligations, alleging an inability to pay in exceptional circumstances. The court then had to determine whether contempt was established, obviously, and the corollary, whether variation was competent absent a material change in circumstances. The respondent was held in contempt. Suspended imprisonment was imposed and the counter application was dismissed. Costs were to be costs in the cause. If you look at paragraph 14 of the judgment, it gives you a good insight into the court's reasoning. The purpose of a Rule 43 order is to provide a speedy and inexpensive remedy. It is interim in nature and is granted pending finalization of the divorce action. Any inconvenience or difficulty is usually cured in the divorce proceedings, where the court is able to entertain detailed evidence regarding the financial position of the parties, enabling it to make an order which more accurately reflects the needs and means of each party. Section 16.3 of the Superior Courts Act stipulates that orders in terms of Rule 43 are not capable of being taken on appeal. Although the constitutionality of this section was challenged in S versus S, it was found to pass constitutional muster. The constitutionality of Rule 43 is not an issue in this matter. It appears that the respondent is attempting to circumvent the non-appealability of the Rule 43 order and to extend the parameters of Rule 43 by asking the court to read into the Rule 43.6 that the exceptional circumstance exists in this matter which would trigger the provisions of Section 173 of the Constitution. Such a contention, in my view, is unsustainable. The counter application, therefore, falls to be dismissed. That is VH versus VH, Free State High Court, Bloemfontein before Naidu J. Next up, we go to the Western Cape High Court, Cape Town. This is a matter that deals with life partnerships and interim maintenance in the jurisdiction of the court to grant interim maintenance under these circumstances. The action arose from the termination of a 29-year life partnership between the parties. It was an application for maintenance pendente lite brought under Rule 6, which deals with applications. The applicant alleged an express undertaking by the respondent to maintain her and alternatively relied on the reciprocal duties of the support arising from a permanent life partnership. The respondent did not file an answering affidavit. They raised jurisdictional objections and legal objections, which you are allowed to do in terms of Rule 6. If you want to oppose the application solely on a point of law, you can file a notice to that effect. The court had to determine the procedural validity of the objections, jurisdiction, and whether the applicant established the requirements for interim relief pending trial. Very risky move to only take a point of law on something like this. In this instance, the approach did not pay off. The jurisdictional point was dismissed. Interim maintenance was granted pending conclusion of the action. Now, please be very fully aware that this was a Rule 6 application in terms of uniform rules. It was not framed from my reading of the judgment. Please do read the judgment yourself and email me if you disagree. From my reading of the judgment, this did not take the form of Rule 43 relief, but interim maintenance was indeed granted. Paragraph 22 of the judgment, the court states, our courts have recognized that the common law may, where constitutionally required, be developed to afford appropriate protection to permanent life partners. The jurisprudence of the Concord confirms that the existence of reciprocal duties of support within permanent life partnerships is capable of legal recognition, referring to Buanya. The Concord recognized that permanent life partnerships may attract reciprocal duties of support. The court affirmed that the common law may be developed where constitutionally required to afford appropriate protection to partners. And that is exactly what the court did per Da Silva Sully J in the Western Cape High Court. Very important judgment, I believe, in terms of permanent life partnerships outside of the strictures of a civil marriage. Next up, marriages. North Gauteng High Court before Strydom J, BTM versus TNHM, decided on 2 March 2026. You can find it on your summaries, page 16, bundle, page 203. It is a matter dealing with the validity of a customary marriage and the requirements under Section 3 of the RCMA, the Recognition of Customary Marriages Act. The plaintiff sought a decree of divorce based on an alleged customary marriage. The defendant denied that the marriage existed and raised non-joinder of the spouse to a civil marriage. The court had to determine whether the Section 3.1 RCMA factors were satisfied, whether the marriage was negotiated and entered into or celebrated in accordance with customary law. The court considered the evidentiary issues raised during the course of the matter, credibility, failure to call key witnesses, and whether the absence of a declaratory order and non-joinder rendered the proceedings effective. So procedurally, the matter was replete with difficulties. The claim was dismissed. No valid customary marriage was proven, and the plaintiff was ordered to pay the costs. I'm going to refer you to paragraph 31 of that judgment and then paragraphs 44 to 48 of that judgment, which are, in my view, quite interesting. First off, dealing with onus of proof or burden of proof, paragraph 31, the court says plaintiff bears the onus to prove there was a marriage and that the marriage was negotiated and entered into or celebrated in accordance with customary law. Next up, from page 44 on paragraph 44 onwards, the court states, on a conspectus of all the evidence presented in the matter, I conclude that the defendant's version, as corroborated by his parents, presents a more coherent and credible account of events than that of the plaintiff. In this matter, the plaintiff failed to plead the applicable customs and traditions which informs the customary law relied on. That's very important. I'll read this again. In the matter, the plaintiff failed to plead the applicable customs and traditions which informs the customary law relied on. Please take that as a drafting note for pleadings involving customary marriages. This is a bit of a cautionary tale. The plaintiff further failed to call relevant witnesses, which could have corroborated her version. The plaintiff further failed to join the spouse of the defendant who has a direct and substantial interest in the matter. And then paragraph 48, the court concludes, I conclude that the plaintiff has not discharged the burden of proving that the marriage was negotiated and entered into or celebrated in accordance with customary law as required by section 3(1)(b). That was BTM versus TNHM, the North Gauteng High Court before Strydom J. Next up, we deal with burial rights subject to a customary or marriage or customary marriages and competing spouses on motion proceedings. The matter, Khoza versus Masana and others, Mpumalanga High Court, Mbombela, the Judge Kekana AJ, summary page 18, bundle page 225. It was an urgent application following the death of the deceased and obviously revolving around a burial dispute. The applicant and the first respondent both claimed burial rights based on alleged customary marriages to the deceased. The court was called upon to determine on motion in urgent court, no less, who was entitled to bury the deceased in circumstances where there were material disputes of fact regarding the validity of each alleged marriage. The court considered customary law principles, proximity, cohabitation, the views of the family, fairness, and adopted a pragmatic approach in this instance. The applicant was granted burial rights and the corpse was ordered to be released to the applicant with no order as to costs. Paragraph 12 and paragraph 24 are our notable quotes. Paragraph 12, the court says burial disputes must be resolved having regard to fairness and the particular circumstances of each case. Paragraph 24, the court goes on to say the inquiry is directed at resolving the immediate question of who is entitled to bury the deceased rather than determining definitively the broader matrimonial rights, which obviously cannot be done in urgent court. And the poor urgent court in matters such as these, with these dense factual matrices, having to triage relief for parties. Right, our last two judgments for the roundup. Thank you so much to all of you who have attended. I'm actually quite blown away by the number of people that popped in today, notwithstanding the fact that it is a Tuesday. I'm very, very appreciative of all of your indulgence, considering my constraints last week. We are now going to the KwaZulu-Natal High Court in Durban in the matter of LCB versus ARB, and our judgment emanates from the pen of Pudafin Jones AJ in the Durban High Court. It is a contempt of court subsequent to 43 order. The matter involves an application for contempt of court and a counter application for contempt of court for non-compliance with a Rule 43 order. The applicant alleged that the respondent failed to pay rental and furniture costs, while the respondent alleged that the applicant unlawfully removed movable property in contravention of the order. The court had to determine whether either or both parties were in contempt, whether their non-compliance was willful and mala fide, and whether further relief, such as relocation or appointment of a forensic psychologist, should be granted. The court addressed disputes regarding movable property and compliance with maintenance obligations. In this instance, both contempt applications failed and were dismissed. The respondent was ordered to pay outstanding rental and furniture amounts, and partial return of movables ordered no interest costs. The court made an unequivocal order what must happen forward, but stopped short of finding either party to be in contempt of the Rule 43 orders. Now, let's have a look at paragraph 8 of the judgment, which I think gives us a good indication of the court's reasoning. The court says, an order declaring a party to be in contempt of court ex facie curiae, outside of court, encompasses the unlawful and intentional disobedience of a court order, which undermines the dignity, authority, and effectiveness of the courts, and thus the rule of law. In order to constitute contempt, the breach must be willful and mala fide. A deliberate disregard of a court order alone is insufficient, since a respondent who genuinely and in good faith believes themselves entitled to act as they did does not act with the requisite intention. The object of contempt proceedings is both to impose a penalty that will vindicate the court's honor and to compel performance in accordance with the previous order. That is LCB versus ARB, and that is from the KwaZulu-Natal High Court in Durban. Folks, before we go into our last judgment, I would love some feedback in the chats, since we're quite a few of you in today. I've tried to keep the roundup much shorter than usual today. By doing so, I've omitted the aspects covered section of our summaries, which we'll keep in the summaries, but which I omitted for the presentation today. I would like your feedback on whether this works or whether you would prefer for me to keep the aspects covered section in, which generally adds quite a bit to the length of the family law roundup. The reasoning is that if we can try and get the roundup to being round about an hour, it will be much more accessible to more people to attend the family law roundup, considering the constraints that they have in their practices. However, I don't want to lose too much of the essence of the cases. So I see we've got quite a few regulars in today. Please, can I ask you to tell me in the chat which you prefer, whether we must keep the aspects covered in or omit them like I did today, to make sure we can run a tighter and a quicker kind of presentation as we did today. For those of you not comfortable giving that feedback in the chat, you're welcome to pop me an email as well. You've got my email address, I'm sure. Send it to me and we will make a decision for the next roundup in May. Our final judgment, folks, is a domestic violence judgment of NK versus MMA, and it comes from the Limpopo High Court in Thohoyandou, which we don't see domestic violence judgments all that often, and we don't see too many judgments coming from the Thohoyandou High Court in Limpopo. We mostly get from Polokwane. The judges in this matter, the quorum, Semenya, DJP, and Chidada was Chidada J concurring. Apologies, we left the J or AJ out. I'm assuming it was J. Apologies if that is not the case to the judges, acting judges involved. Matter is NK versus MMA, and it deals with domestic violence. This was a very interesting judgment because it deals with the procedural aspects in the domestic violence court under the Domestic Violence Act. Now, it was launched in the form of a review. Now, a review, as you will know, is when there is a gross irregularity in the proceedings. Now, the matter fell before a magistrate who then referred the matter on review to the High Court in terms of Section 304, capital A of the Criminal Procedure Act, rather than the correct Magistrates Court Act 32 of 1944, which deals with magistrates' court proceedings, which are not criminal proceedings. After the magistrate had concluded that the interim protection order had lapsed when the applicant failed to appear on a return date, the High Court then had to determine whether the magistrate followed the correct statutory procedure. Should the interim order have been extended when the applicant failed to appear, which it should have, and whether the subsequent reinstatement and continuation of the proceedings were competent. So procedurally, there were a lot of little funny nuances in the domestic violence court. The High Court determined that the proceedings were grossly irregular as envisaged under the Madge Court Act, Superior Courts Act, and the rules, and were then vitiated. The proceedings were set aside. However, the High Court did leave the door open to the applicant, saying that the applicant may institute a fresh domestic violence application, almost inviting the applicant to approach the court again. Paragraph 12, the High Court states, the magistrate committed a gross irregularity by failing to extend the interim protection order. The interim order has therefore lapsed. It cannot be reinstated in the manner the magistrate did in this case. The proceedings stand to be set aside. The applicant may apply for another protection order if she so desires. What is our takeaway as practitioners from this? If you act in domestic violence court, if there is a postponement for whatever reason, please ensure that you have the interim order extended pending the next return date. Oh, guys, thank you so much for all the comments and feedback coming in the chat. I can't wait to work through it and to determine how best to do the roundups in coming months. Folks, that was the Family Law Roundup, done unconventionally all the way from the Bushveld with a little router over here, which worked very hard, and on a Tuesday, no less, when I know all of you are very, very busy. I appreciate the indulgence that we could move the matter of the presentation out today, and I really do appreciate a turnout of quite a few people when I really thought that we were going to have an empty house. I really appreciate you taking time on a Tuesday to be here. For those of you not yet on the Think Legal WhatsApp groups, please go to thinklegal.co. Jump on the groups. I am going to be sharing the bundle from today's session as a free resource a little bit later. I'm not going to be sharing the summaries. That's unfortunately our IP, which takes a very long time to do and took even longer than usual this time round because I did it in the bush with monkeys jumping overhead trying to steal my cooler box. So please do, if you're inclined to, go and pick up the course pack. We'll see you for the next Family Law Roundup, which will be early in May. I believe Nadia has already started sending out the information regarding those that session. So please do register for that. And from my side and from the team at Think Legal, thank you for attending today. Have a lovely rest of your week, and we will see you on the WhatsApp groups and at the next Family Law Roundup. I'm going to end the event now, and I wish you all well. Thanks so much. Goodbye.